But part of my job, really, in terms of academic advising, is listening to students' stories. It's a big part of what I do all day. And so I got interested in this idea of stories. I'd always had this one line from this Muriel Rukeyser poem on my wall. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. And when I first read that, I thought it was beautiful, but also, deeply true, right? Because stories are the way that we make sense of the world. They help us figure out who we are, where we're going, and they shape our worldview. And then about a year ago, one of my coworkers introduced me to their TED radio hour. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. And I got hooked immediately. One of the first episodes I listened to featured this woman right here. This is Diana Nyad. I don't know if anyone has heard of her. So she was the first person to swim from Cuba to Florida. She did it a couple years ago. She was 64 years old when she accomplished this. It's 110 miles. It took her 53 hours, and she had no shark cage or anything like that. So I just thought that was really impressive. And I want to play a clip from the TED Radio Hour interview with her because she tells a name about her story. And I forgot to talk about evaluations. At the end of this, these two lovely people over here will hand out evaluations, if you wouldn't mind filling them out. Thank you. All right, so TED Radio Hour with Diana Nyad. Here we go.
I'm Guy Raz. I'm just really intrigued by this story from when you were, 4 or 5, and your dad told you about your name, about Nyad.
Yeah.
This is Diana Nyad, the long-distance swimmer.
My dad was a Greek Egyptian. He spoke in a very thick accent. He was dramatic. He was theatrical. He was emotional. And the day I turned 5, he calls me in. We had a little den. And he said, come here, darling. Today you are 5 years old, and I have been waiting for this day. Because today, darling, I am going to tell you the most significant thing I will ever tell you. Look in the dictionary. Naiad. In Greek mythology, the Naiad swam in the lake, river, fountain, and ocean to protect for the gods. All right? Now, look in my eyes. Next definition, Naiad. Girl or woman champion swimmer. Oh my God, darling, your destiny is written in black and white. So the word, I became a swimmer, and oddly enough, I'm a Naiad. But that's not the word I heard. I heard the word champion. And I believe it. I believe it somewhere deep on a cellular level.
Isn't that a great story? So, this just shows you how powerful stories really are. And here's the thing. The stories that we tell ourselves, whether they be false or true, are always real. So it doesn't matter if the stories are true or not, they become real to us. This was written by Maria Popova, and she collects a lot of her writings at brainpickings.org. If you haven't been there, you could lose yourself for hours. I'd highly recommend it. She writes about, life, love, grief, human beings. But anyway, this quote really stuck out to me. And I feel like in the current political climate, we're sort of seeing this on a big scale with the Trump campaign, right? Because he's saying, okay, the Mexicans are coming and they're destroying our country, and the Muslims are here and we're not going to let any of them in anymore because it's all of these other people, it's their fault that America is not great. And even though this has no basis in reality, the story itself is becoming real for a lot of people. So you see this happening on a large scale. But you also see it happening on an individual level with people like Diana Nyad, right? Whose story of her name really became very real to her. So all of this brings us to Tetris. I can't even, I don't know, do people still play Tetris? Okay, so I was at a professional development workshop a few weeks ago with some colleagues who were talking about the Tetris effect. And they were talking about this guy who played Tetris so often that when he would go to the grocery store in the cereal aisle, he would be lining up the boxes, you know, to make sure that they lined up in rows like Tetris. And the same thing would happen when he would go downtown in the city skyline. He would be like seeing the Tetris pieces falling from the sky and trying to match them up into the buildings. And really, my colleagues talked about the common assumption in this culture that seeing is believing, right? We have to see something to believe it. The Tetris effect actually kind of turns that around. We believe something, and then we see it, right? So we have Tetris on the mind, we see Tetris pieces everywhere. We have beliefs, we have worldviews, and then we start to see these beliefs and worldviews play out in our everyday lives. Again, it's another way of saying that our stories become real. This is similar to confirmation bias, which many of you may have heard of. So confirmation bias is this idea that we may have a question, and we sort of have an answer already formulated in our head to the question that we're trying to answer. But we go out and we look for information about this question. The only information we find is the information that supports what we already believe. And we actually unconsciously ignore a lot of the information that might discredit or disprove our original hypothesis. So this all kind of came to a head for me professionally when I heard this guy called Louis Macias. He's currently the director of admissions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he talked about this exercise that he did at a conference with about 200 academic advisors and other higher education professionals. He did a similar exercise to what we just did with LGBT youth. Only he asked, what's the first word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of first generation college students? Right? So these are the students who are the first in their families to come to college. He tallied up the results, and an astounding 81% of the respondents had something that had a negative connotation. Right? So instead of words like brave or determined, most of the words that they came up with were underprepared, disconnected, at risk. And so Macias goes on later in his presentation to talk about how our perceptions influence our practice. And again, this comes back to stories, right? So the stories that we tell ourselves influence what we see and what we do. So I thought, with all, the Tetris effect and confirmation bias and how powerful stories can be, I really needed a way to figure out how to outsmart my own brain if it was playing tricks on me and telling me that the stories that I had in my head are true, even if they're not. So I thought, maybe we could do something along the lines of Queer Eye. And clearly, this is not going to be Queer Eye for the straight guy, no fashion advice. Like this is my fashion for the day. So if you're disappointed in that, I'm sorry. I won't be offended if you leave. But basically, this is a Queer Eye for those of us who are interested in telling a more complex story, right? And so just to break that down a little bit, I thought it was first good to define the word queer. And this is from David Donahue. Queer is a word with two meanings. It can be an adjective used as an umbrella term to describe the LGBT community. We all got that, right? I mean, that's pretty common. This is the definition, this is part of the definition I really like. It can also be a verb meaning to trouble, to question assumptions about dichotomous thinking and conceptions of what is natural or inherent. So just to break that down a little bit, to trouble, right? To bother, to be abrasive. We're going to start questioning our assumptions about dichotomous thinking, so binary thinking, getting away from the either or, the us and them. And then I really like this last piece too about what's natural or inherent, because so much of the rhetoric that I feel is used against the LGBT community somehow says that we're going against nature, right? That has been historically one of the arguments that's been thrown at us. So we'll talk a little bit more about the natural and inherent piece a little bit later. So just to go back to, thinking of queer as a word that helps us to question our assumptions. A queer eye then asks us to go beyond our binary thinking and challenges us to think about what is normal or natural. It is a lens through which to see the world that requires us to be aware of the stories we may previously have ignored, dismissed, or overlooked. All right? So if we go back to that, oh yes, so basically a queer eye helps us to see a different perspective, right? So it was never addressed. Just to go back to that first line that we started with, the universe is made of stories, not of atoms. This is not a literary critique at all. This is a line pulled out of a poem, out of context. But a queer eye may look at this and say, yes, the universe is made of stories, and it's also made of atoms, right? It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both. Both atoms and stories bring meaning to our lives, purpose, structure. Does that make sense with the either or? Okay. And then quickly, just to return to the first generation college students, I think it's really important to see a more complex story. We go back to that 81% of respondents having a negative connotation when they think of first generation college students. We can't stop there, right? That's not the whole story. Clearly, that's not the whole story. And so there's this sense of needing to tell a more complex story with the folks that we work with. And I work with students. Many of you maybe work with patients if you're in healthcare, clients, children. So this is something that I hope can be useful to people in lots of different areas in your professional life and also in your personal life, to just make the stories that you tell about people and that you tell about yourselves a little bit more complex. I want to go back to a TED Radio Hour interview, this one with Chimamanda Adichie. She's an author, and she talks about this idea of the danger of a single story. So, I'll play that for you. Maybe. Or maybe not. Okay. Well, basically, if this doesn't start working, I'll tell you the story myself.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family, and so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity.
So the people you met at that time, I mean, they had a single story.
Initially, I was amused by it, and then I became annoyed by it. just having to constantly deal with people's surprise. And I think what's dangerous about thinking that it's only one thing is that it just limits one's ability to understand or engage or connect.
How do you frame your own story? I mean, you or any of us. How do we sort of own our own stories?
I don't know that we do. I suppose one can try. I constantly actually have to remind myself that if I want to understand a place or thing, that it can't be just one thing. You can't know one thing about a person or place and think that that's it. So I think it's normal, I suppose, maybe human, to make assumptions and to depend on just one single thing.
Isn't that great? I love how she really just breaks down the idea of the single story in her own life and how she had that single story about another individual, and then she came into a culture where she was that individual and people had a single story about her. And I really like the idea at the end where she talks about this idea of normal. It's normal for us to do this as human beings. So again, I think that that's why having a tool, something like a Queer Eye, can help us figure out, okay, yeah, this is what I do. This is my MO. This is normal for me, but it doesn't have to be that way. I can be more complex. I can tell a more complex story. So I just want to go now to these lovely cards that you all graciously filled out this morning or this afternoon before we started. And I'm just going to read through them quickly. I had no idea what anyone would write. There's some really great stuff in here. So we'll go. Fun, diverse, accepting, lack of support, green hair, Tumblr, magical, not validated, diverse, disempowered, awesome, homeless, misunderstood, gay kids, resilient, inspiring, isolated, marginalized, future, authentic, brave, powerful, undervalued, vulnerable, resilient, marginalized, inclusive, proud, power, confused, complicated, afraid, magical, resilient, colorful, curious, resilient, energetic, unhappy, queer kids who screw gender, brave, bold, different, queer, feisty, introspective, questioning, relationships, self-aware, and at a disadvantage, hurdles, love, cool, invisible, unique, grinder, intersectional, silenced.
Wow.
That's an incredible list. Sorry?
Sounds more positive than negative.
Yeah, I was really curious to see if there were any patterns that developed similar to the first generation college students. I think that this group as a whole has a very queer eye, right? Like that's a complex story right there. But what I wanted to do with this exercise is just to help us think of the first story we tell, and then make sure that it's not the only story we tell, right? So if you think of the first word that came to your mind when you thought about LGBT youth, and again, do this not just with LGBT folks, do this with the people that you work with, you come into contact with every day. Think about the first story you tell about them, and then make sure that you continue to tell additional stories and to make sure that you ask other people to tell their stories as well. Thank you, that was fun. All right. So let me just go back here for a second. We've talked a little bit about stories and beliefs, right? How our beliefs influence our stories. And I want to move now to language and the impact that language can have on the stories that we tell. So this is just a quick example. You can think of many ways that you could describe the situation, right? The car hit the other car, it slammed into it, it lightly tapped it, it smashed into it. Every word that you choose to describe this particular situation changes the meaning of the story. Do you see that? I mean, if a car hitting another car is different than a car smashing into another car. That's just to get your mind thinking about how language can change the story. So I think, in the LGBT community, when we're talking about language, a lot of times we're trying to break down this binary with gender. And the onslaught starts before we're even born, right? So pregnant people will get asked, oh, are you having a boy or are you having a girl? Assuming that there are only two options, and also that the sex of the child is going to match the gender of the child. So this starts, again, before we're even born. And then it continues in preschool, in kindergarten, This is something I got from last year's conference, and I wish I could remember the presenters to give them credit. But they talked about how in elementary schools, teachers often say, boys and girls, please line up. Boys and girls, come sit on the rug. It's always boys and girls. And so again, you're just reinforcing that there's only two options, and you're also leaving out students who don't identify, as a boy or as a girl. And then obviously this continues into adulthood, right? We have sir and ma'am, ladies and gentlemen. And this really limits the stories that we tell about ourselves if we're not thinking critically about gender. So I just want to play you a clip from a poem by Andrea Gibson. I don't know, some of you may be familiar with Andrea, but so they really break down the difficulty with the gender binary, and just take a listen. Thank you for your patience.
When I was a kid, I would sometimes secretly call myself Andrew. Would tug at the crotch of my pants the way only pubescent boys do. Ran around pounding on my bare chest like Tarzan. It's not that I thought I'd grow up to be a man. I just never thought I'd grow up to be a woman either. From what I could tell, neither of those categories fit me, but believe me, I knew from a very young age never to say, hey dad, this Adam or Eve thing isn't really working for me. I mean, what about all the kinds of people in between? In the 3rd grade, Lynette Lyons asked me where all my Barbies were. I lied and told her I got in trouble, so my mom took them away. I didn't dare say, Barbie sucks, Lynette. For that matter, Tommy, so does G.I. Joe. I want to grow into something none of us has ever seen before, and gender is just one of the ways we're boxed in and labeled before we're ever able to speak who we dream we are, who believe we'll become, like drum beats forever changing their rhythm. I am living today as someone I had not yet become yesterday, and tonight I will borrow only pieces of who I was today to carry with me to tomorrow. No, I'm not gay. No, I'm not straight, and I'm sure as hell not bisexual, damn it. I am whatever I am when I am it. Loving whoever you are when the stars shine, and whoever you be when the sun rises. Yes, I like girls. Yes, I like boys. Yes, I like boys who like boys. I like girls who wear toys and girls who don't. Girls who don't call themselves girls. Crew cuts or curls or that really bad hair phase in between. I like steam rising from the body of a one-night stand. I like holding hands for 3 months before kissing. I like wishing your body was Saturn, my body 1,000 rings wrapped around you. You wanted to be a Buddhist nun once last night. You held my cervix between your fingers. I thank gods I don't believe in for your changing. Tell me we'll be naming our children beautiful and nothing else. Tell Barbie she can go now. Tell G.I. Joe to put his gun down and find a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a girl boyfriend. Fuck it, y'all. G.I. Joe just needs a friend. I want to bend in 1,000 directions like the sun does, like love does, like time stopped. So the hands of the clock could hold each other, and we held each other like I held these words for too many years on the tip of my tongue. I am my mother's daughter. I am midnight sun. You can find me on the moon, waxing and waning, my heart full of petals, every single one begging, love me, love me, love me, whoever I am, whoever I become, love me, love me, love me.
So, yeah. So they're pretty incredible. And I was only going to play about half of that, but I'm glad that it ended up working out that you saw the whole thing. The 2 lines that I wanted to point out with that, it's not that I thought I'd ever grow up to be a man, it's just that I never thought I'd grow up to be a woman either. Neither of those categories fit me. And, they go on to say, what about all the people in between? And then again, gender is just one of the ways that we're boxed in and labeled before we're ever able to say who we really are, is basically what she's saying. And so with these 2 pieces, I think that Andrea really hits the nail on the head. We lack the language to talk about ourselves and to tell our stories. And sometimes we need new words. And then other times we just need to use the words that we have in a different way. So I don't know if you saw this a month or so ago, the American Dialect Association, they vote for a word of the year every year. So this year's word was the singular they. which I think is fantastic. This is how they defined they. Gender neutral singular pronoun for a known person, particularly as a non-binary identifier. That's beautiful, right? That's the word of the year. And so this is really the beauty of language, is that it grows with us and it changes with us and it helps us tell a more authentic story. And just so you know, the LGBT community is not the only community that's experimenting with pronouns. I heard an interview with Robin Wall Kimmerer. She works for the State University of New York, also at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So she's a biologist, she's a botanist, and she's also the director, I want to get this right, for the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. So she's talking about pronouns for things that are animate in our environment. So when we refer to a tree or the ocean, we would say it, right? That's our pronoun. And what she's saying is that we would never call a friend it. And so when we're talking about the environment, these beautiful trees that we love, we're calling them it. And if we had a different pronoun, it could actually change the way we see nature as alive. And so I just thought that was a really neat example of another discipline looking at language, specifically pronouns, in terms of changing the story. And I think just getting back to the LGBT community, we've seen a huge shift in language over the last decade or so. I feel like maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it was very common for us to say, and for the larger community to say, you know, oh yeah, that person was born a boy, but they transitioned and now they're a woman, right? And we've gotten away from this idea that people are born a certain gender, and now we're using the language of assigned a gender. And this, again, really changes the story, right? Because when we use the word born, it's like we're born one thing and then we change into something else. But oftentimes we're born ourselves, right? And we're figuring out how to live authentically as ourselves. So again, just a small shift in language, I think, really changes the story. And many of you may be familiar with the show Transparent.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, there's a clip from the trailer that really gets to this assigned versus born change of language. And so I want to play that with the technology.
Just help me out here. Are you saying that you're going to start dressing up like a lady all the time?
I mean, all my life, my whole life, I've been dressing up like a man. This is me.
So yeah, it's a fun show. But do you see again how the language really changes the story, right? It's not, the character's not a man dressing up as a lady, but rather someone who's been dressing up as a man for her whole life. That was great. So there's some other small changes that we can make in language. Many of you may have seen this article on Mashable, 5 accidentally transphobic phrases allies use and what to say instead. So, and we've covered a lot of this already. So instead of using the phrase preferred pronoun, any thoughts about that?
Just pronouns.
Yeah, exactly. Just use the word pronoun. Works just fine. So saying someone was born a boy or born a girl, we kind of just talked about that, right? With the change of language to say they were assigned a certain gender at birth. Using he or she as a catch-all, they, that's an option. Or just rework the sentence. Using the term self-identified to qualify a trans person's gender. Again, just drop the self-identified part. You know, it's unnecessary. And then finally, saying someone is female-bodied or male-bodied. Basically, if you're trying to target a specific group of people, if you're looking to talk to, non-trans women, just say non-trans women. Don't worry about the female-bodied or male-bodied. So I just think, if you find this article online, it's quick. It's a great kind of article to pass along to friends, family, people in the community. And then finally, having to do with language, I just want to read a part of another article by Aidan James Kosesa. And Aidan talks about passing, the language of passing. So here's what they write. For many of us people who are trans, the goal of transition is equally balanced between feeling comfortable in our own skin and showing the world who we really are. The problem is that when trans people use the word passing for what we've achieved, it diminishes everything that we're fighting for. To pass for something immediately connotes deception and untruth. Think of plagiarists passing off someone else's work as their own, a look-alike cousin who could easily pass for his relative. To look at trans people expressing their authentic selves and say that they pass for men or women is to diminish their identity by implying that it's an act. Telling a trans woman that she passes is like saying, "You're not a real woman, but good job faking it." And at the heart of this problem is the word passing itself. Language has power. When people tell us, or worse, when we tell ourselves, that we're only passing as men or women, that our identities are a sham or a mask meant to trick the rest of the world, the narrative of deception takes hold. Trans panic murders are the most horrifying consequence of this narrative, but it also seeps into everyday life in subtle ways. To paraphrase Janet Mock, we're not passing, we're being. Trans people need a new word to replace passing. I prefer being recognized. So do you see, again, how language can really change a story, right? It shifts the story that we tell about ourselves and about others. Not just passing as a man or a woman, but being a man, a woman, gender queer, gender fluid, not needing to, pass as anything or anyone, not needing to stick within that gender binary, but being recognized for who we truly are. So just to bring this back to the idea of a queer eye when we're looking at language, the normal language in English, at least, is very binary when it comes to gender, sexuality. There's a limited number of options, and I think we need to look at that, and I think that the LGBT community has done a great job of looking at that with the queer eye and trying to expand those stories. And also just looking at the binary nature of language when it comes to gender, when it comes to sexuality, and telling a more complex story. So I want to move into this idea of identity. And when I was thinking about how to, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about the changing the passing to being. As a trans guy in Arkansas, I feel like I have a little passing privilege, and I get told that a lot. So I feel like it's good for me to acknowledge that I pass,
right,
compared to a lot of people in my community. But how would I change the language there? Like, how would I acknowledge my privilege to pass without using the word pass?
Yeah, that's a great question. And feel free to jump in with comments, because I really I don't know how to answer that question. I think go ahead.
My question back is he talking about what he says himself or somebody says to him? Because it's two different answers. If he says it to him, he is male. He didn't pass for male, he's male. If somebody says to him, "Boy, you pass for a male, you look good," that's more of a question. What do you say to him, that person?
Is that what you're asking? Or is it more of an internal, like, how do you acknowledge that you are, you identify as a particular gender and pass for that gender, but it's a privilege to do so because not everyone in your community, in your circle of friends, has that privilege of passing?
I think that's what it is. It's that internalized thing.
Right, right. And I think some of it does have to come back to the way that we see ourselves and accept other people in our community. Not everyone can quote unquote pass, like you say, in the general in the general American culture. So it's a fascinating thing to think about. I wish I had a better answer to that question, and maybe other people do. Yeah.
I think the word recognize works. I think you can still say I'm recognized as this, you know, to tell your friends who you don't pass that I feel like I'm recognized as a boy where you are, you know, and I understand that struggle still. So I thought
well, I don't pass. Okay. So what? All my friends recognize me as a girl. You know? But where I come from, oh no. Everybody looks at me, goes around with the camera, you know, saying, oh, there goes that guy in the dress, you know. Okay. Give a crap. That's their problem. You know, if they can't grow up and be themselves, you know, I'm not gonna worry about it. I've only got one life to live, and I'm gonna do that. Regardless of what others think of me, I know what I think about myself. And that's what you have to do. You have to think about yourself. And I know it sounds selfish and everything else, but it's not. Because the world doesn't think of you as who you are. Only you do that.
Thanks.
You find yourself, as you go through transition, you find out who you are. And there's lots of different situations and lots of ways you'll run into people. If I'm in a grocery store and I'm going to have a 5-second conversation with somebody, it'll be ma'am and she'll never question me. If I'm sitting down and I'm having an hour-long conversation with somebody, they may question it. But you know what? Whether they agree with it or not, they will know because I know who I am. And because I know who I am, they're going to say, well, she knows who she is. I don't know if I agree with it, but she knows who she is. And that's all it really has to go with it. It doesn't go any farther than that. It doesn't need to. Any kind of unconfirmed, I don't know the word I could use, any kind of not feeling comfortable about it on their part is their problem.
All right, thanks. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just speak, to what you're asking. I think it's a little bit different, but I find myself using that, needing that language when it comes to now, because so much has changed since I've transitioned, and am recognized as male. So the words that I use usually is when I talk about that change and that entitlement that you're talking about is perceived. So much has changed now that I am perceived as a white male. That privilege that comes along with being a white male, and it's big. It's a huge change now. People talk to me differently, people treat me differently, and sometimes it makes me sick, physically. And so I use perceive a lot. So I hope that helps.
Could you give us more examples of the what it's like to have privilege?
Oh God, I could go on for hours, but mostly it's just, I used to work at a call center, and with my higher voice, I guess more feminine voice, it was, may I speak to your supervisor all day long. I worked in tech support. And as soon as, usually the male voice person, I guess I can assume, on the other end of the line, as soon as they felt that they knew more than me, it was may I speak to your supervisor. Literally one day to the next, when my voice dropped, it was, all right, chief, okay, buddy, thanks, man. And it was just so drastic that I was literally physically ill several times at work. I had to quit that job. So it's everywhere, and it's everyone we know, and it's most of the time subconscious and unintentional, but really sad.
Thank you for sharing that. Thanks. Yeah, that's great. And I hope that we'll have more time at the end too to continue this conversation and other questions that you might have. I want to have you break up into smaller groups. I was going to give people big sticky notes, but